So Gina Sigler and Alex McBride coming to us from STAT COE, the Scientific Tests and Analysis Techniques group at AFIT, the Air Force Institute of Technology. Today they're going to be talking about survey do's and don'ts. And for the purposes of this kind of workshop, they've volunteered to have you guys jump in with questions as they're going through the talk. We do have kind of a long session right here, so they said that we will be taking a break halfway through, so we will get a chance to stretch our legs and come back in afterwards. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to you guys.
So I'm Gina Sigler, and this is Alex McBride. We're statisticians. And we both come from the Scientific Tests and Analysis Techniques Center of Excellence, as he said, and we've got a background in surveys. But I'm assuming that some of you in the audience probably do as well. So what I wanted to start out with was just kind of a general, what are your expectations for this? So I've got a lot of slides. I've got even more slides that I deleted to do this. So we have multiple classes on surveys, and this was me putting together what I thought would be kind of like an overarching thing on how and where we do surveys. But I wanted to get expectations from the group of what would you actually like to get out of this. So this is our general do's and don'ts. But are there questions that you want answered? Are there things you want to see? Don't feel like you have to say anything, but online I think we have chat monitoring too, and go ahead and just jump in.
Are you going to discuss validation?
So I deleted those ones, actually. I can discuss validation, but I deleted those slides because I have about, I'm going to say, 8 hours worth of material in surveys. So total. Anything anyone would like to see?
Do you have a couple of examples towards the end of particularly good surveys or particularly bad surveys?
Again, I had deleted that because we had an entire class discussion on that, but I think we've got a couple good and bad survey question types in there. And we can definitely discuss some of the good and bad survey things up front because I've got a couple examples in the slides that walk through things.
A ton of survey experience myself, but what type of surveys do y'all usually do over there at AFIT?
So while we're at AFIT, the STAT COE tends to work for all of the services. So we've done surveys, particularly her and I with AFLC-MC on female body armor. And so I've worked with the Air Force and, let's see, Space Force on a couple survey things, which was interesting. But we work with all the services. So you name it, and we could probably create a survey on it or have at least talked a little bit to folks that might create a survey on it.
And I actually support exclusively Department of Homeland Security programs. And so I see a lot of surveys used in like operational testing. So, you know, for example, if they're trying to implement a new software program and it's moved into operational testing, they'll just, you know, deploy that system and then gather user feedback through a survey. So that's where I see them a lot.
What about open-ended questions?
Oh yeah, we're gonna get to some of those. So the how to write the open-ended questions, and then how on earth do you analyze open-ended answers?
Sensitivity analysis?
A little bit, yeah.
Controlling for biases and like how you represent the greater population. I'd be curious about that.
Okay, I'll definitely stick a little bit in on that. Yes, Chloe?
Perhaps some visualization options for how to present your results once you've done your surveys.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe some remedial techniques for opportunistic sampling.
Opportunistic sampling, I like it. All right. Yeah.
Digital surveys versus paper surveys and the psychological effect on that.
Sure. I've read papers on that, so yes, we can definitely talk about that. Okay. Anything else? Or from our Zoom audience?
Nothing on there yet.
It's good to see what other survey people are doing and spreading the message around.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a community effort, right? So everything that I've collected, I don't claim to be a complete expert on surveys, but we've certainly seen a lot, right? So whatever you guys have, we'll make this collaborative. I want to learn from you guys as much as you guys learn from us. But we do have a whole bunch of slides up here, so obviously I'm gonna sort of go through them, but I'll try to hit on the parts that you guys really want to talk about because that's what's important to us. Okay, so pros and cons of using a survey. Probably don't need to tell you guys twice about the surveys and what they're doing. But why do we do surveys? Well, because they're easy, right? I'm going to put easy in air quotes. But they're a good way to reach a wide audience. I think that's the best way to think about it. We can use them for exploratory things. They're fairly simple to analyze in general. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of wrong ways to analyze them. But for the most part, you can sort of understand where the questions are coming from. And you can just read survey responses and kind of cognitively put them through the mill, right? So not too bad in terms of a kind of efficient and inexpensive way to do things. But unfortunately, the data quality is where we really suffer for surveys, right? And the bias. So non-response bias is absolutely huge. We just did a survey last week that I sent out for anybody that did the STAT COE autonomy workshop. So we did a pre and post survey for that one, and we got 50 responses back from 180 participants. And the whole office was like jumping up and down because we never expected to get that many survey responses. But it's because we promised them that if they filled out the survey, they'd get slides, right? So you got to incentivize sometimes to fix that non-response bias. We found something that they would probably want. And then accuracy, because people lie on surveys. All right, so here are our top 5 common mistakes. And we actually put this in a newsletter, but I polled the community again. So not terribly accurate, perhaps, in the numbering here. But polling the community of survey experts, we found out that these might be things that surveys might have as their common mistakes. So the first is no research question. So I don't know how many times I'll go up to a group, and I've done some survey analysis outside the DoD, and we'll see that too. I worked with nurses up at the University of Michigan on dementia studies. And they just had some surveys that they had created or found. And they're like, all right, we're gonna send these out. And I'm like, well, what are you trying to do? And they just kind of look at me. I'm like, well, we want feedback. Yes, but for what? What's the purpose? What are you doing with your survey? Is it gonna answer the right question? They had no idea. And so we had to start back at the beginning, figure out if their tools were actually gonna do what they said they did, and work from there. 2 is biased questions. So we tend to write questions that are worded in such a way to get the response that we want, which is not what we probably should do. And then similar to that is leading questions, right? So you lead them down a certain path on how you want them to answer something. Short answer only. So these are the most difficult to analyze. We will get to the analysis part during the end of the presentation, but just having the short answer, probably not your best bet because of the lack of quantitative information you can get. Now, we will talk about you can still get some quantitative information, but it's limited, right? And then finally, too long or overwhelming surveys. So we have issues a lot of times with, we can't often get people to finish the survey, right? So they'll start doing the survey, and then at some point they'll just tire and be like, nah, I'm done. Especially with the paper surveys, right? So you can kind of trick them into clicking the next button if you do the virtual. But on the paper survey, if you seriously hand your pilot something that's going to be 5 pages long, he's going to look at it and go, okay, no, and you lose out on any information that you might get, right? So anybody think of any other common mistakes they see in surveys? Yeah.
Distracting graphics.
Distracting graphics. I like it. All right.
There's like unnecessary. I guess it's more of a paper survey.
Yeah, but still, that's fair. Yeah.
Incomplete response scales.
Incomplete response scales. Yes. Yes. Or confusing scales. I just did a thing last week where they gave me a Likert scale, and I could not tell what the heck was going on because they gave me answers that didn't make any sense, and I couldn't figure out what went first and what went second. Yeah.
Too long or unclear directions.
Unclear directions. Yeah. So they write you a giant paragraph at the top, and by the time you get to question 1, you're not sure how you're supposed to answer it.
Really written questions, multi-part questions inside a single step.
Oh, yes. Yes. And then how do you analyze that, too? Because you can't break it apart and, yeah. Yes. Yes, the solution to that as the analyst is fix the survey before it goes to the people, or otherwise just start banging your head on a desk. Yeah.
Not administering the survey at the right time.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's fair. Too early and or too late. We often teach a lot of classes, and if you send the survey out immediately when the class ends, you'll get a lot of responses. If you don't, forget it. They won't answer you if you send it. Like if you finish the class on Friday, you better as hell send that survey on Friday, because if you wait till Monday, you're not getting responses.
There's too many surveys.
Too many surveys, yes. A survey fatigue. All right. So we're going to walk through our general process for surveys. This is the super boring part. The analysis and the actual question schemes and stuff is way more exciting. But I'm going to harp on this anyway, because this is the #1 problem that we have seen, and that is people don't know how to generate a problem statement for their surveys. So often enough, I will get something where someone has already created their survey, and they just want me to analyze it, right? Because that's what statisticians are for. That's what data analysts are for. We are here to analyze. We have nothing to do with the planning. And I'm always going back to, what question am I trying to help you answer? Any good planning person will tell you that this is where you begin. You start with the end in mind. But the research question should drive the scope of your survey. It should drive the questions that you are trying to answer. It should drive the metrics that you are collecting. You should never actually have a survey fully created and not know how you're going to analyze it. Right? So the whole process is that I want to be able to do something almost in a DOE approach. And actually last week I saw a really cool thing with Affotech. Chloe there in the back was part of this team, and we had come up with factors that were actually going to be factors and responses in the surveys. So we were thinking beyond just the general design of experiments approach, but you can actually still talk about factors and responses in your survey methods. And sometimes it helps because people that have that DOE knowledge can get behind this and then try to figure out, oh, it's going to feed into how I'll write my survey. So surveys need clearly defined test variables and a good problem statement. What do you guys think makes a good problem statement? Anybody that's done surveys before? Good. Okay, yeah.
Working on aviation, I might care about how, say, workload and usability varies across the operational space. So you're talking about factors and levels like DOE. So I might want to consider certain flight conditions or something. And I would use a standardized survey to get data.
Yeah. So anytime I'll go to my next slide here. Anytime we do anything in the stat, we tend to bring up this graphic. And it's our stat process. And the whole thing is that you start at the beginning and figure out what you want to do. And it changes for different things. But the end, I'm making a program decision. And so the #1 thing that I talk about when I'm talking about my problem statement is the decision that you're going to make should be based on the problem statement that you set at the beginning. So this is not survey specific, but you can still see where I'm going to do a little bit of planning. I'm going to design a survey. I'm going to execute my survey. I'm going to analyze my survey. And I'm going to potentially go back up and have to change things, right? So it's a cyclical process where I've got all those arrows in there. And here's an example problem statement to attack that might be a little bit easier. So imagine you are tasked, this group is now tasked with creating the comfort and fit of a new prototype helmet. And we're actually going to look at different survey questions and whether or not you think they would fit this. But here is a problem statement that I'm going to give you. And notice it's kind of lengthy, right? It's multiple sentences. But that doesn't actually make it a bad problem statement. A lot of people are like, we're going to go pithy, right? I want this to be super short. No. You want to actually include everything that you want to talk about during the survey. So, unnamed aircraft. The pilots are in need of a helmet, and they're going to provide suitable protection. So we've already got some buzzwords in here. I've got suitable. Acceptable level of function without sacrificing comfort. Okay, so female body armor. When we did this, we were talking about a comfort metric, and this was a whole big thing for the Air Force because they had no idea how to define comfort. So then the second half of this is they're trying to do something out of an optimization, right? We care about the mission effectiveness, we care about protection, and we care about performance. So I am already looking at this thinking, all right, here are my responses, right? So I want to be able to look at protection, effectiveness, and performance. I need to know all of these things. And I'm not going to be able to get all of it from a survey, but it gives me a start. And then I have a definition of comfort because the whole group could not decide, and this is actually what we used for female body armor for the comfort definition. But comfort refers to having a proper fit that will decrease long-term medical risks to the pilot relative to the current system. So I don't want a helmet that when we do the ejection seat testing is going to throw their head forward and snap it off when they throw it back, right? Yes, I've done ejection seat testing too. So it's a big issue, and I need them to not feel the weight of the helmet. There's a whole bunch of helmets out there now that have chin straps and neck straps, and you can adjust them separately, and if you adjust one too tight, you're like pulling your head back in the seat. Yeah. So I need to ask them the appropriate questions to figure out my problem statement. Right? And this is a little tricky because I have to get my entire group of testers, of pilots, of researchers, of whoever's going to be part of my team to agree on what this is going to look like. So finally, down at the bottom, I have my research question for my survey, and the group brainstormed this together, and it's how do pilots feel about the prototype helmet compared to legacy in terms of comfort and fit? So I have my focus areas of comfort and fit, and I'm doing a comparison. It gives me a baseline to measure to. Often with the surveys, you're going to need a baseline to measure to, and we're going to talk about some analysis methods specifically for the baseline thing. Questions? Thoughts? Good problem statement? You see the issues? I changed it from the original, so. Yeah.
Would you add a number of objective questions that would support your survey, taking the measurements of pilots' head circumference, or
yes,
would that support that research question so that you could then have that to compare to later?
Absolutely. This is a kicking off point of what I'm going to try to be able to answer for the program when I'm done, but we are going to have a whole list of stuff that I'm probably going to want to talk about in between that'll be individual questions answered by the survey. Wouldn't it be great if I could just stick this, like, hey pilots, how do you feel about the, that would be wonderful. Just one question.
We've got a question online. Is feel the right word to include, or do we want to ask about their beliefs?
Ooh, good question. So the group here had voted on feel, but that might not be right? So feeling is a very subjective question, but this is a very subjective topic. So again, as the statistician, I would defer to the team. I can't answer that question, and I think that's another big thing that comes into this. So the best statisticians are the one that can get the group to say what they need to say and not lead the group down the path of the wrong statement, right? So I don't have an opinion on that, but perhaps belief is a better word there. All right, any other questions or concerns on this?
I see that this captures the comfort question. Yep. Is the idea that the protection and long-term medical risk is being done by a different part of the test program?
Yes, part of it is being done by the fit part. So we're going to physically probably measure and talk about how it feels on their head and whether or not it fits, because that's where the safety portion comes in. If it's too loose, then they could get struck by something, and then it's not going to have a proper mission effectiveness or protection. And for the actual optimized protection, we're going to have to do something else where perhaps there's like guns being shot at the helmet to make sure it does what it needs to do. But I'm not going to ask them how it went when we do that. Yeah.
Do you maybe want to consider that you're probably going to have a relatively limited time frame to do this study, and your outcome goal is reducing long-term medical risks, so you have no way to actually objectively measure that particular outcome?
Yes. So what we're going to have to do probably is, in addition to the survey, we're going to have them probably wear the helmets for an extended period of time and almost do like an accelerated life test on how things are going with their helmets. So they would normally not be wearing their helmets 24/7, but I might make them wear it during a part where they wouldn't necessarily be wearing it, just to see how that's going to go. And that'll play into my survey planning. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to piggyback on the other points that were made. I mean, it seems like there are two things here. I mean, there's the safety and medical risk of the helmet, which presumably you could measure in a number of ways, like with a crash dummy or, a live fire test, ensure that it offers protection in different types of dangerous events. And then you can assess the comfort by asking or giving the survey to the actual users. And because you're measuring what they think, I mean, their level of comfort is best described by them, but it seems like there are two pieces here.
That's totally fair. And I would never want to do my survey in a vacuum, right? So that's the other mistake that I sometimes see being made by the teams, is that they're like, oh yeah, and we'll do the survey later. It's like, no, the survey is actually going to be part of your test planning effort, right? So if I have a response that's going to talk about the fit maybe that's not part of my survey, I want to be able to pull that in and talk about the problem statement, which is not just for the survey, but for the test as a whole. So while we did, the female body armor thing, while we did the survey portion of it, I also did the whole test plan, right? So everything was tied in together. It's just we're focusing on the survey portion here. All right, so implementation. So, hand.
Question, I'm not sure of the mechanism of it, but would the pilot have access to the problem statement?
Depends on if I wrote it on the survey. I wrote the research question. What?
Is that common practice? Is it something that's not done? Because the problem statement doesn't necessarily put the comfort as a premium, but it does say that there's improved capacity or capabilities to it. So with the problem statement, a pilot might say, well, given the other improvement, I can deal with minor comfort will become secondary. It's nice if it's more comfortable.
Right.
Where in the absence of the problem statement that provides context of improvement and performance, I'm more likely to land and I'm less likely to be taken out of the sky with that helmet. And then comfort is also part of it. So there's both physical comfort, but also intellectual comfort that can improve performance when you know you're giving something that makes things better.
Right.
So that's why would problem statement inclusion help?
So yes, I can attempt to repeat the question for the Zoom audience. So that's okay. That's okay. You're just far away from the table mic. So they were asking about intellectual comfort and whether or not the problem statement might be a part of the survey itself. So correct me if I'm wrong, but if they have the problem statement and can see the different parts, meaning that the comfort is almost secondary to the fit and function of the helmet and whether or not it's actually going to improve the performance, then they might choose to take a better functioning helmet over something that's more comfortable. And the answer is, I didn't give them the problem statement. Should I have? Maybe. But because that was specifically trying to measure my comfort metrics, we were going to take that piece away from the user, from their decision. Now, we had a pilot in the group that was going to give an opinion on, here's what the general pilot audience would think. And so they're going to weigh in on the ultimate weighting of what that looks like. But as long as the helmet does as good or better as the legacy, then the comfort will play that role that we need it to, and I'll have the metrics to back it up. So they did not get the problem statement. They did get the research question for the survey, though, because that gives them an overall statement of where this is going. So that was written at the top of the survey. Yeah.
One question I have about the research question, Major Deaver from Altec. To me, that feels a little bit leading, because if the old helmet was bad, then anything better, even if it's still bad, could still be bad.
Yes, completely. And as soon as you put the human in there, I can't really get away from the fact that it still might be bad. Now, hopefully, the performance is going to outweigh in that point, because we get to a point where maybe we can't have something good, but if I can improve upon something bad to something better, then depending on the cost, schedule, whatever that's going to take, maybe I'll take it, maybe I won't. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't get to a level of badness, you're right. Okay, so implementation, again, I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to think about the end in mind. I'm going to look at my analysis methods. I'm going to look at what all I need to do in planning. Am I trying to do some operational testing in the meantime? Am I going to do some pre and post testing? While we don't want to create unnecessary work, I still want to take my time in the planning phase to make sure that I'm doing everything I need to properly implement my survey. That also means that I'm thinking about my, as I said, test variables, right? So everything that we do is based on those factors, levels, responses, and ultimate questions that we're trying to ask, right? So one of the things that we do, and I should have made the little SUBO joke for anybody that's taken a STAT COE course before, but anytime we're trying to measure something, we want to make sure that we have a practical consequence and that I have a clear route to my data analysis, right? So when I try to create something like a survey question, it's based on the ultimate research question that I'm looking at. And I also have like a goal in mind, right? I know what I'm measuring. I know what I'm trying to get out of a question. If you have a survey question and you don't know what it's for, you probably shouldn't have it, right? I will find this a lot of times on surveys where they'll recycle, right? So they grab something from an old test and they'll throw that in there and they'll be like, oh, you know, we had all these survey questions before. I'm like, what are you getting at with this? They look at it and go, I don't know, it was on there before. All right, well, we can cut this down then by a lot of questions just by figuring what you're gonna do with it in the end. And maybe we need that, maybe we don't. So well-defined research questions and making sure that you actually have your test variables will lead to maybe not answering the wrong question. Yay.
And I think something that goes along with that is to just make sure that if you can get the data elsewhere rather than having to use the survey to get it, look into that, because like when we did our female body armor study, we had all these questions because we wanted to get measurements for these women. We wanted, you know, their chest circumference, we wanted height, weight, all those things. And it, you know, so we were actually going to go through the process of having to like manually measure them ourselves or have our scientists do that. And then after the fact or shortly after that, we found out there was a database that had all of that in there already. So we could have completely eliminated that portion because that's very time consuming, you know, to do that. And so we could have actually eliminated that and characterized, you know, the female population based on those measurements and things already. So just looking, you know, make sure you kind of do your due diligence to see if you can find that information elsewhere before implementing that in your survey.
So this is just a slight nod to sampling theory, which, again, I could teach an entire class on sampling theory, so we're not going to get into that super depth. But thinking about how you're going to actually choose to take a sample from your population, right? So the most common approach is, well, I get to ask who I get to ask. So, and we don't get to decide most of the time whether or not they're going to answer. I'm hoping that they're going to answer. Sometimes they're motivated, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes I want to do kind of a stratified sampling method too. So I want to make sure that I'm not just looking at one person or one place or something that's going to bias the answers that I get to my survey. So again, going back to the female body armor, it's the easiest thing, and we kind of have the thing to walk you through. Although if you want any other examples of surveys, I could certainly talk about others. But we were doing females only, so then we didn't have to worry about the gender effect, but experience. So how we had people that were doing different jobs. So if I've got inexperienced operators, they may think the helmet fits incorrectly. Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's supposed to be that tight. They have no idea because they haven't really used it much. So I want to make sure that I'm not just doing a single location that maybe is doing this one task with the helmet, but over here I've got super experienced operators that would know things differently. And then professional background's another one. There's probably a whole long list of things that you could take into account and either stratify or just make sure that you're not missing out on as you look at your target populations. And then figuring out how to attempt to motivate the audience to respond. My one word to the wise is don't tell them they have to if you can't tell them that. Because you sometimes do have the authority to tell them that they have to respond, and you sometimes don't. And so making it very clear whether you do or don't, and whether or not you have to go through human factors in order to get approval to give your survey to people is very important.
Question online from Eric Engel. Have you seen surveys used to address questions associated with cyber resilience, e.g. system owner or product owner opinions? I think maybe looking for examples or if you've seen implementations of that.
Interesting. I have not. Have you?
Mm-mm.
Anybody in the room? Sadly, no. I can picture sort of how that would be done because I've done it for some software testing, but not specifically for cyber. And I think it would relate back to how we kind of do cyber tabletops, in that you're trying to reach a certain point of information from your subject matter experts, per se, which is a different type of survey than if you're trying to get user feedback. But yeah, I don't have experience with cyber particularly. All right, survey distribution. So you've decided to give out a survey. Congratulations. And you've got a couple choices on how you're going to do it. So we had been asked to discuss the differences between survey collection methods. Email and web-based are the most popular, and I do have a slide on kind of venues and different platforms that you can use to distribute. Face-to-face usually get you more feedback. So if you actually literally go out and interview everybody, you will get way more survey responses because they don't want to say no to you to your face. It's usually how that goes. However, you will get more lies because they also do not want to tell you things sometimes to your face. So those are the pros and cons of the face-to-face discussions. You can do emails and phone calls, not super popular in the DoD. And you can do mail-in surveys, also not super popular in the DoD. The email and web-based have a bunch of issues in that, well, the email's fairly simple unless your survey gets stripped off of something. But the web-based has a lot of firewalls and things to go through if you're going to do the web-based survey, because as we have done things across many, many different platforms, we've found that in the Navy, they block this type of website. In the Army, they block this type of website. In the Air Force, they block this type of website. And at AFIT, they block everything. So making sure that you can actually get your survey out there and that your users can use it is kind of an issue too. Is there anything anyone wants to talk about in particular with the methods of distribution? Because I know that was a concern at the beginning. Yeah.
I think like web-based could be good because, you know, if you are working with like a computer scientist, they could have the question set randomized order for each participant to mitigate like fatigue.
Yeah.
For your respondents.
That's fair. I tend to favor web-based, honestly, because you can make it way easier to click, and people tend to type faster than they write, so it takes them a lot less time to do the free response. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've used email-based surveys before, and one thing I noticed is that so you send a survey document out to the respondents, and you tell them when they're supposed to fill it out, whatever. So it's like beginning and end of shift task, whatever. I found that if you leave them to their own devices, they may or may not follow your directions. And so if you want to send something via email, or really whenever you put it out, you have to have some kind of like thing in your administration plan where you're like gonna assure that they do it the way you say to do it, you know, whether that's like a ping you send them an email reminding them, hey, please fill this out, or you have someone there to have eyes on the administration. That's helpful. Like I've noticed, at least. I don't know if there's a way to work around that. You guys have seen similar things or have a workaround to that?
Usually my method to the madness is to give them some type of reward when they turn it in. So we teach a lot of classes, and I used to teach at University of Wisconsin. So I got my master's there, and then I stayed on as a lecturer and faculty associate for 3 years. And the students would get not bonus points, because that was wrong, but they would get additional help on things if they turned in the surveys, because at the end of the year you had to turn in the survey. And so when I came over here, I was like, okay, how can I motivate people to turn in their surveys? What can they get? Because they're always like, well, what's in it for me? So usually if there's something that you can do that they want, to make them turn it in. That sometimes helps. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know.
Well, and the tricky part is getting people who are kind of in that middle ground on where they stand on maybe what you're collecting data on to respond. So I always think about like product reviews or like Amazon reviews. Like if you're really unhappy with your Amazon purchase, you're probably going to get on there and write your review and, you know, vent your feelings. If you really, really like it, you're probably, you know, maybe going to be motivated. But if you were just kind of like, yeah, it was okay, it's, you know, what I expected, you're probably not going to take the time to, you know, log on, write your review. So that's kind of the tricky part too, is trying to capture not the extremes, but also the people that are in that middle ground. And that's really hard to do with surveys.
Can you guys talk a little bit about data quality for the different methods and being able to validate responses in some versus others?
Face-to-face is obviously the easiest to validate because you literally have your person in front of you, but then it gets into the question of validity earlier, where are they telling you the truth? And the answer is that there's a whole bunch of papers out there that say about 80% of your respondents are and 20% are not. So you can take that for what it's worth. You can also make assumptions on the, you know, the really motivated people in one direction or another, or the people that are answering your surveys. And so if I have like a calculated mean, that's probably pretty accurate. So that's not a terrible way to go about it either. And as far as web-based goes, it is favored because people like the anonymity, and that tends to be better. Yeah.
That was my question, whether or not anonymity was guaranteed, especially if you're in uniform. There's things you might want to say if you know nobody can come back to you and say, hey, why did you say that?
So there's ways to ensure that. Actually, it's one of the reasons we sometimes get used is because you give the surveys to us and we don't care who you are. So we can basically take things that even have, you know, the information that we were talking about before, like body information that could be technically tied back to you, but because we don't care who you are, you can give honest opinions. I can remove all of that identifying data and then make it so that the comments themselves are completely anonymous.
But is that explicit to the participant?
Typically, yes. Because they are told at the beginning whether or not it will be tied back to them. It's usually something that I will encourage to put on the top of the survey, whether the survey is anonymous or not. And often it becomes very obvious whether your survey is anonymous or not, because if you're literally handing it to your supervisor, probably not anonymous. But if you're sending it to a third-party person, then we can say, you know, responses will be kept with us. That's what happened with the body armor. Responses were kept with us, and so they got to honestly answer the question. Okay, so I'm not gonna harp on this. This is a thing for online survey tools. I mostly made this slide because you can see that there's a whole bunch of things out there, and they have their pros and cons, right? So on some of them you can only make a certain number of surveys. Sometimes you can't make many questions. Most of them are free. I try to stick with this. The big universities almost always use Qualtrics. It's extremely expensive, but you can do whatever you want with it. That's why they like it. For our last thing, I think we were using Microsoft Forms, which I did not update on the slide, but that was working in all of the DoD forums. So for the record, Microsoft Forms works on Army, Navy, Air Force, and Space Force. Computers currently. And don't forget that your surveys probably require PA approval. So before you send anything off, even if it's going to be internal, the fact that you are using it on any external site means that you have to get your survey PA approved. So give yourself at least, 20 days to do that.
What is PA?
Public affairs. Yep.
Qualtrics is also FedRAMP approved now. You still have to ask, but Qualtrics is FedRAMP.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, I was gonna say, when I made the table, I'm not sure if it was or not, so.
All right, so now we're gonna get into question choice and some different question types. So there's open-ended and closed-ended questions, which we've already kind of touched on. Open-ended questions are exactly what they sound like. It's just, a basic question, open-ended response. They are very difficult to analyze because everyone's gonna obviously provide a unique, different response. They do take a little bit more time to answer, so depending on, who you're interviewing or who's filling out your survey, they may not be super motivated to really take the time to give a well thought out answer. But they do help researchers gain new insights. So they can provide information or perspectives that you didn't consider originally. So that's definitely a benefit. With closed-ended questions, you are forcing the respondent to select one or more answers. And so these are quicker to fill out, simpler to analyze, but one of kind of the pitfalls is forcing them to answer. So you want to make sure that your response choices or your answer scale is kind of covering all possible answers, but while also not putting too many answer choices in to where they're, feeling overwhelmed or not sure what to choose. So some types of closed-ended questions, we have a dichotomy, which is just a standard yes-no question. So it's a very limited amount of information, and they can be really prone to wording bias, but they are really quick and easy to answer and easy to analyze. So they can be useful, have you ever worn the new prototype helmet, yes or no? Basic things like that. Multiple choice, you're going to select one answer or select all that apply. So again, this is going to force the respondent to pick a single choice. They are simple to analyze, and it's going to give some limited categorical information. So things like what size helmet do you wear, or select all types of helmets that you've worn during flight testing. Again, you want to make sure that all of your answer choices are available. So, if you're testing 3 prototypes and you didn't have prototype 3, obviously that would be an issue. So just making sure you have a comprehensive list of all your responses. Likert scale questions are really common, so these help obtain positions on certain issues. So a Likert scale is just, rate your attitude from, 1 to 5, 1 being very uncomfortable, 5 being very comfortable. So again, Likert scales are an easy way to get somewhat quantitative information about people's attitudes or comfort or things like that. It's really important, though, that you have an odd number of responses. You want to have this neutral response. And sometimes I've seen people leave that out because they think it's like an NA, like a not applicable, but it's really not. Like a neutral attitude is a legitimate attitude. So you want to make sure you have that in there for people to select that, because without it, you're going to be forcing people to either choose uncomfortable or comfortable when maybe in reality they genuinely feel neutral about it. With that said, you should also have the non-applicable response if it's applicable to that question. So if there's a possibility that that question is not going to be applicable to someone, make sure you have that available. Otherwise, you'll see people just leaving things blank or, again, picking a response that isn't really how they feel. Yes?
I have a quick question. Do you have to define all of the parts of the scale, or is it okay to just have the left and rightmost answers defined as like uncomfortable, comfortable?
If you're asking, so if you're using the same scale for several questions, I think it would be okay to maybe define it once and then have, just the numbers from there on out. But if you're asking about, comfort or, then you go on to ask about, I don't know, what would be another one, another attitude?
Rate your agreement.
Rate your agreement, yes. So then you're going to ask about their agreement with something, then I would recommend probably, switching it just so to keep it kind of consistent and so like they know what they're answering.
I'm thinking about it because you know how there are sometimes scales that are like rate this 0 to 100% or something.
Yeah.
You're not going to define 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 100. So like you sort of leave it ambiguous to the respondent to decide where they fit on the scale. So is it okay to do that with a Likert scale that's only 5 or 7 choices or something?
Yeah, I think so. And they do have 7-point Likert scales. Again, you just want to make sure that it's appropriate for what you're asking. It gets kind of tricky because, if there's no real difference between, comfortable, somewhat comfortable, very comfortable, that sort of a thing, it's just not very informative at that point. So you want to have a scale that is just giving you enough information without getting to, there need to be clear differences between those options. Yeah, so here's some other common Likert scales. So frequency, so, how many times do you do something? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, always. Agreement, so rating your agreement with something or a statement. And then your satisfaction, so rating your satisfaction with a new product or a new technology or things like that. And survey development. Are there any questions about question types? Okay, it was pretty straightforward. So survey development. So in the 1940s, they collected opinions of free speech. Half of the respondents were asked if they felt public speeches against democracy should be forbidden. The other half were asked if they felt public speeches against democracy should be allowed. So the thing to take note here is just the language, right? So we have forbidden, which kind of has a negative connotation, and then we have allowed, which is somewhat more positive. So you can see that the results here, we had 54% that endorsed forbidding those speeches and 75% said no to allowing the speeches. So this just goes to show how the wording has a huge effect on, how people are going to interpret that question and maybe the results that they provide. And so one way to actually get around that is to somehow in your survey ask the same question both ways to kind of see if their answers are consistent. So if their attitude is consistent with sort of the more negatively toned question and then the more positively toned question.
What do you do if they're not the same? Do you throw them both away?
I don't think you'd throw them away, but I think that that would be an indication that, maybe the way you asked, so obviously the way you asked it was sort of contradictory, but you wouldn't throw it away. I guess you would just take that into account when you did your analysis.
Yeah, so there's validity and reliability
Yeah.
of surveys, and those are some of the slides that I ended up taking out because it's very deep to read into them. But you can use some metrics to try to figure out how off it is and whether or not you need to remove the respondent. So if they're just literally answering at random, there are metrics that will tell you that using the setup of this questions, positive and negative framing, and figuring out how to do that, and then you can throw the survey away.
So you look at it by respondent.
Yep.
Can I ask, is it like the SUS, I'm trying to remember which one they do that already.
System usability scale, yes, that is correct.
So ask the questions like one after the other. Is there a reason why you wouldn't want to, I always thought that was kind of odd, like why wouldn't you want to ask the question and then the opposite question a little bit later so that people like don't, I don't know.
Yeah, for the SUS.
It gives you a chance to reset, read and other stuff.
I think they mostly do it just because it's so short that it doesn't really matter. But in really good survey design, they'll put it in there so that it'll be like, at the top and another one kind of in the middle. And so it'll catch it better. Yeah.
Okay, so then positive and negative framing of your question. So you want to think about how you're going to sort of present your question. So here's two examples here. Due to safety issues, use of the system should be prohibited. And then so not to limit options, use of the system should be permitted. So the first statement has a negative framing and then the second has a positive framing. So depending on how you frame your question, it could introduce bias into your data and the responses that you receive. So a good way to make sure you get the respondents' true attitudes is to have them answer both positive and negatively framed questions like we just discussed. So that leads us right into types of bias, which is a huge concern for survey data. And this is why it's so important that you really put a lot of thought into your survey up front. It's funny because, yes, everyone can design a survey, but that doesn't mean everyone should. And, we always laugh about this because, like, in school, like, I took an entire semester class on survey design. Like, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's kind of one of those things that everyone thinks that they can do, and they can. It's just not going to be that great. And that's, the risk that you run. So one of the obvious types of bias is your non-response bias. So you just have respondents who are unwilling or unable to participate. They just don't give you a response, don't reply. Voluntary response bias is when your sample is volunteers. So obviously they don't have to provide any information or kind of that self-selection. So they do volunteer, right? They're willing to, maybe they're really motivated to give you their feedback. Again, that kind of goes with like the levels of motivation. Are they really unhappy with something so they're motivated to volunteer their feedback? Are they really happy with something? Whereas you kind of get like that middle ground where people aren't going to give you some data. Response bias. So this is introduced when you have leading questions. So those are poorly worded questions that are going to lead respondents to answer in a certain way. So that all has to do with wording and verbiage. Social desirability. So these are things that, like touchy subjects, right? If you're asking a question about, abortion or something, you might have someone who is resistant to maybe admit their true attitude because they don't want to be looked at differently or what have you. And then measurement error, using the wrong response scale for the respondents to answer with. So just using an inappropriate Likert scale, or maybe, you didn't have all the possible answers on there, so you're just not going to get as good data. It's going to introduce bias into your data.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if this is bias or what you call it, but I did an OT where 2 different units tested the same system. One unit was just running ragged. They had just been on deployment and were about to go on another deployment. And their leadership, I don't know, tended to have a negative attitude is the only way I could describe it. And their surveys reflected that. The other unit was a National Guard unit that rarely got to test these cool systems. They were super excited about it. And their responses were all like really positive. So what is that effect? What do you call that?
Maybe like group bias? I don't know.
Group think, preconditioning bias.
Yeah.
I see that a lot in OT.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I think in that, and in that scenario, you'd almost want to analyze the groups separately, because at that point, they're not from the same population anymore. Yeah, did you have a question?
I mean, that would be a form of sampling bias, right?
Yeah.
And you would want to have representation for older groups that are potential users, or older groups that have potential stake.
Yeah.
And that goes back to in the introduction slides about just making sure your target population and your sample is going to be representative because of issues exactly like that.
So you need to make sure you get.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You need to make sure you get that out of your survey too. So if you're serious, you need to know what group they're from.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's something else, yeah. You could maybe include a question that would maybe somehow identify what group they're from without identifying exactly who they are, that sort of thing. So okay, so leading questions. I'm sure we all pretty much understand what this is. So just a poorly worded question that's going to convince a respondent or lead a respondent to answer in a certain way. So sometimes maybe it's including additional information in that question that is on sort of one side of the issue that would influence their response. So here's an example. We know the new financial system has drastically increased efficiency across the THS. How would you rate the usability of the updated system? So this little snippet of information is leading them, right? It's leading them to think like, oh, well, if it's drastically increased efficiency, then, I should be very satisfied with it. So can anyone think of a different way we could word this question that would make it just more neutral?
Just delete the whole first part to start with.
Yeah, so just delete that first.
Completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Change, neutral, not improve or reduce, but just changed.
So how would you rate the usability of the change system?
So, as compared to the old one? Yes. So it has changed. How do you compare the performance or the usability?
Yeah, or you could even just use the name. So, right, if the system has a name, how did system A, or rate the usability of the updated system compared to system A. We probably need a different scale at that point, but something like that, right? Okay, so social desirability. So this is, again, just being resistant to maybe admit how you feel about a certain issue. If it's an anonymous survey, this isn't as big of a risk, but you still might have people who are hesitant to answer honestly. And so please rate your supervisor's ability to communicate his or her expectations. You might be a little hesitant to answer that honestly if you think that your answer is going to, come back to your supervisor and they're going to see how you really feel. So this can be an issue. I think to sort of mitigate this, again, is to just ensure that your respondents feel, comfortable that their identity is going to, stay hidden. It's not going to be associated with their responses and things like that.
And for these kind of questions, I have taken so many questions from companies where they're like, if it isn't a 5, it's a failure. So how do you mitigate that inherent bias people have nowadays because of the press surveys they've had?
I mean, I don't. I hate when they do that. I laugh at them when they tell me that, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm still going to answer the survey the way I'm going to answer the survey. But there's no good way to look at that when you're doing the analysis. If people are going to bias that way, people are going to bias that way, and there's no way to ask them, do you have an attitude towards giving 5s? It's unmeasurable, basically. So it's it's just something that we have to be aware of. So if you see a bunch of it, you're like, something may be going on here, but it's going to be a hidden variable.
One of the other things I've seen is that question right there is, if you rate it very poor, some people would look at it as you're attacking your supervisor. And I've seen, questions that are better that are like, rate your leadership's ability. So it's not just that one person, it's kind of across the board.
That's fair.
In general.
Yeah.
Or how often have you felt that your supervisors or leadership's communication has not, frame it as like, instead of poor to good, like often to never, or never to often?
Okay, so measurement error. So I've mentioned this a few times already, but just providing the wrong scale or answer choices for the respondent. So it's a balance between being comprehensive and including, everything that they might, feel or how they want to answer, but then also not making it too overwhelming or having too many options to choose from. So sometimes there can be issues with consistency amongst the group, but an example of this would be, please circle your marital status, single, divorced, or married. Is that comprehensive?
Widowed.
What's that?
Widowed. It's not comprehensive. It's missing.
Yeah, so just making sure that you have every, category represented.
Also, don't put question marks if it's not a question.
Good point. We have a typo. Okay, so question and answer wording, avoid double negatives. So that's even just kind of like, grammar. Make sure your grammar is good in your survey. So facilitators were not unhelpful. It just leads to confusion. Only ask about one topic at a time. So someone mentioned that at the beginning. So we call those double-barreled questions when you're asking two things within one question. How would you rate the comfort and safety? And that becomes an issue because, what if the system was comfortable but not safe, or safe but not comfortable? How's the respondent going to answer that? So you want to make sure that you only answer or only ask one question at a time. A lot of times when I'm like reviewing a survey, I'll just ask them like, do you really care about both comfort and safety? If so, just make it two separate questions. If it's like they're two very similar words, then it's like just take one out. If they're synonymous, just take one out and just ask how they feel about, one or the other. And then making sure you have mutually exclusive question choices. So again, this has to do with your responses. So if you had something like, does this happen? Yes, sometimes, really, no, never. No and never are the same thing. So you don't want anything that's, duplicated like that.
Taken from a real survey.
And then Likert scale questions. So they can be unipolar or bipolar. And so here's an example. So the top one is unipolar. So we go from not satisfactory to very satisfactory. And then our bipolar question has that neutral response in the middle there. So we can go from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. And then again, these Likert scale questions are a great way to measure attitudes about something or agreement. So rate the agreement with the statement the device was comfortable. What level of discomfort did the product cause? And then they would have a rating for what level of discomfort they felt. And then we'll talk in the analysis portion how you would analyze these responses. And then our free response questions. So we already talked about some of the pitfalls there, but you want to just make sure you word it in a way that is going to warrant more than a yes/no response. So here's our example. Do you notice any differences in the fit or comfort of the new helmet versus the legacy helmet? That's very easy for someone to say yes or no. Whereas if we reword that to what differences do you notice in the fit or comfort of the new helmet versus the legacy helmet, it's going to encourage them to explain those differences and give more of a explanation on how they feel. And I also think it's important to mention, open-ended questions, like I said, can be good for kind of those exploratory purposes, but just don't overuse them. So just a quick summary of what we've covered. So just keep a narrow focus on your key issues. Everything should map back to your problem statement and your research question. You shouldn't be asking anything that doesn't directly tie back to that. It's just going to create unnecessary questions for them to answer. It's going to make it longer than it needs to be. Make sure you write with clarity and with good grammar. Have someone proofread it before you send it out. Use familiar vocabulary. You know, depending on who your target population is, you don't know necessarily, you know, their education level or their professional level. So just try to keep it as simple as possible so that pretty much anyone could read it and understand it. Keep your sentence structure simple. Try to avoid bias or error as much as possible. Again, a great way, you know, to check for that is just have someone else read it, because you're gonna be more likely to miss things that someone else could maybe catch. Something else that we encourage, but it's often not realistic, is if you could get like a small pilot group of people to take your survey. So just a really small group, have them take the survey, and then just kind of analyze the results and see, you know, were these questions interpreted how I intended for them to be interpreted? Am I getting kind of, you know, the answers that I might expect? That's always a great way if you can, you know, fit that into your test schedule. Use structured questions. Characterize your answers carefully. Make sure you have all answer options there, but keeping it, you know, an appropriate amount, not too overwhelming. Select suitable categories, so make sure you have all categories. If it's like that, your marriage, or what was it? The marriage question we had on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your marital status, yes. Make sure you have all your categories listed, and then use your scales effectively and appropriately. So are there any questions on the question types or the survey development? And this all kind of falls into like that upfront planning stage. So a lot of thought should be kind of put into this.
So analysis methods. First of all, you should plan this from the beginning. If you don't, you're liable to end up in the situation as the statistician at the end where you're looking at something, they just hand you, we gathered data, what we're going to do, and you get to tell them what your survey died of. Unfortunate, but it has happened on numerous occasions. So taking the question development into account and thinking of the analysis up front will save you so much heartache in the end. Types of analysis, this is not exhaustive, but this is the ones that I'm going to cover today. The most important is the one at the top, descriptive statistics. And then we build down through other typical methods. So principal component analysis, also known as PCA, factor analysis, cluster analysis, hypothesis testing, you might use more than one method at a time, and regression analysis. So descriptive statistics, he's missing. I was going to throw this over. So IDA has a tool on testscience.org that I just learned about yesterday that does Likert scale descriptive statistics with lovely graphs with a shiny app. So check that out if you want to use that. I will typically use JUMP. I'm a huge JUMP proponent. So we will throw that and it does all of these different methods. So the cool thing about descriptive statistics is you can do it on anything. There's always some graphical or numerical method that you can do with it, even text response, which we're going to get to at the very end there. I can do something on everything descriptive statistics. So it doesn't matter what the survey data is. I can do it.
But you don't use bar charts on categorical data, of course, or you don't use box plots, I mean, right?
Well, no, I was going to say it depends on what you're doing. So if I do literal counts of words, then I could go back to like weird kind of funky box plots. I've made a bunch of really random things. Or you could have like the categories at the bottom and then have a box plot of something else relating it. So I can
But I've seen
tie it
box
in.
plots done on Likert scales, and that makes no sense with a mean.
That's weird. Yeah. In fact, I think you might be getting to my next slide. Okay. Not truly continuous data. So Likert scales, beware. Number one pet peeve as a statistician is incorrectly using your data, and Likert scales are not continuous. So sadly, people will take the Likert scale data. They will think, oh, look, a number. Not realizing that often, sometimes, seldom, and never are not numbers, right? We can assign them numbers, but they're not actually numbers. And the distance between them is arbitrary. So my question posed to the audience is, what do you think the numerical difference is between seldom and never, and often and sometimes? And do you think the distance is the same?
Like averaging zip codes or area codes.
Yep. Yep.
What have you got?
So there is a rank, right? So we're not going to deny that there's a ranking going on here. But this is a discrete numeric thing that's not even real. It gives you a scale, but it's not a true number. And so descriptive statistics and means have no business here. You can do a median that has a rank, because this is rank-based. That sort of makes sense. But do not be fooled by the cute little numbers that are associated. You're actually playing with those words, which is why when you said, can I put a word on this end, a word on this end, and have them guess in between, you can, but this becomes even a bigger danger.
Something else you can do though with Likert scale data is you can calculate like the proportion. So you'll have counts for, you know, how many people rated never, how many people rated seldom, and then maybe you want to, you know, show people, you know, 80% of our people or respondents rated this question 3 and above, right? So you can do that, which kind of will give you an idea. It's sort of a way you can, you know, share that data, but
fake it till you make it with
yeah,
your
but
numerics.
But you're going to get into that with proportional odds, logistic regression, and RIDDITs, right?
Yep. So Likert scale analysis, you can do many different things with it. Like I said, the median, you can make bar charts, but it's gonna be dicey. You will see these used many times. They make me cringe every time I see it. Non-parametric tests are the best, so things that don't assume that you've got normally distributed data. So you can make the cute little bar chart. There's nothing wrong with that. But the thing where you're trying to actually see its distribution when its distribution is not truly there is sometimes a problem. Things that I have done in the past: calculated overall score, and actually this is in the back of the slides, which we probably won't actually end up getting to today. But if you add 4 or more Likert scale question scores together to make something, it becomes an actual almost continuous value. Again, research is out there on this to tell you that you can do that. You can have something be acceptable or unacceptable responses to the question. So if I think about a question in terms of, I never want them to answer never, 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 right? This is bad, these are okay. I can do something like that, and then I can kind of break it up, right? And then the analysis I can do would be a calculated proportion above a certain threshold. Now, hopefully you're planning ahead enough that you don't have to do these all the time. But this is like the, you know, I've had people come to me with Likert scale questions. They've already given their survey. It's not ideal, and I have to figure out a way to get something out of it. Because again, if I had an unacceptable answer, why the heck did I write it as a Likert scale in the first place? But it happens more often than you'd like that the Likert scale questions are on there, and before you know it, it's gone out to your respondents.
Can you give an example of where it might make sense to add, like your comfort example? Where would you add 4 questions together? I've never done that. I'm just curious what that was.
Okay. So good question. So I actually did this on a nursing survey for dementia. So you'll see a paper up there by me that was working with that. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to rate a knowledge level. So we asked multiple questions about their knowledge on a topic, and then I added those together to get a score. For comfort, I might rate their comfort in multiple areas. So for the helmet, you might rate the comfort of, like, does it move? And so I might talk about that. Or the comfort on the chin strap tightness. And so I would have an overall almost comfort score, and I could add the question numbers together. Obviously, I would have to line them up so that if it's kind of like the system usability scale. So if everybody gave me a 5 on something, I know that that meant super comfortable, or if it might be switched, right, for the scale. If it's a 1 on this, then I know it's super comfortable, and I can make a score value.
To interpret it, don't you have to have the same units on each question?
Not if it's a Likert scale.
You mean I can add comfort versus cost?
Oh, you shouldn't do comfort versus cost, but I'm talking about, no.
You said I could.
But if you want a comfort metric, then you create a score.
You gotta have the same units on each of those elements for your life.
Right, but you don't have to be measuring the same thing. Like if I'm measuring, the pinching of the helmet versus the tightness here, I don't have to have it be the same thing on the scale.
But it's helmet comfort on all questions.
Right, helmet comfort on all questions. So I only have to have a metric based on 1 unit.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah. All right, PCA. So tricks of a couple of these methods is that survey questions are often correlated with each other. It's a problem. But it's one that we can fix in the analysis. So you can know going into it that your survey questions are going to be correlated with each other because it's really hard to write independent questions. In fact, I haven't actually found any documentation that says it's possible because people interpret your questions differently because they're human. So instead, we can do something that basically breaks down the questions into components, as it were, and it removes the correlation between the questions so you can look at individual components. So this does not produce a model, words to the wise. This is not going to come out with an end answer of like, I've analyzed my survey. It gets you something else.
What did you use to correlate categorical variables?
What did I use to catch?
You can't use Pearson's R correlation coefficient because that assumes it's continuous.
Right, right.
So what did you use?
For the female body armor?
To do principal components, you've got to have a matrix, like a correlation matrix or covariance matrix. I don't see where that came from in the case of Likert scales.
I mean, in Likert scales, you feed it in like it's continuous data.
Oh, foul. It's not.
It's not, but this method doesn't care. And
well, I mean, the method doesn't care, you're right.
The end results, interpretability, doesn't actually matter either. Because you're looking at them as a whole unit. And so you can feed it in regardless of how that's going to work. And I'm going to get to clustering, which is a better method if you're going to do that.
Much better. I don't agree with PCA in this case.
Gallup did a lot of their work on their questions through the clustering.
Yeah.
And they,
now that.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is one of many methods. Now, you can use it on Likert scale data. You can. But is it the best method? No, I'm going to show more.
Well, you could find the means in Likert scale data also. And that's crazy.
No.
Okay. I'm just saying that's the same thing for PCA, unless you can define a correlation coefficient for categorical variables.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not going to stop people. I'm going to cringe, but I'm not going to stop people from doing it, right? I'm going to explain what it does and then hope that they use it correctly if they're going to use it. It's the best I can do as a statistician at this point. I have no control. So what you're actually doing in the back is you're creating something that takes your variables and transfers them into something called components. And the components are going to be uncorrelated from each other. That's the whole goal, is that I take variables and I change them into something else, and they have weights according to those variables. So math hidden. So here you've got two scales. These are obviously not Likert scales because in a perfect world, I wouldn't use it on a Likert scale. But you've answered the questions on -6 to 6 and -6 to 6 for whatever these are. Data notional, right? No actual things here. And obviously I can see that there's a correlation between my questions. So I want to get rid of the correlation, so I rotate it and create components. So what PCA actually is doing in the background is it's taking and removing the correlation so that I have a nice flat correlation between my variables. And all I've done is actually, if you can see that, rotated it. Right? So that's what principal components is doing in the background. Tricky part about principal components is its interpretation. We're not even going to touch that because the components themselves might or might not be interpretable. Sometimes it looks super easy. Most of the time you look at it and go, I have no idea what that component means because it's got loadings on it for each of your variables and you're like, these numbers are crazy. What it's actually doing is linear algebra in the background. So you can figure things out in terms of terms like eigenvalues, cumulative variance, and a scree plot. So you can see that what you're actually doing is trying to amount for the variance between everything. And you start with really high numbers and get low and look for an elbow in your curve. Factor analysis does something similar. And we're going to do a little pro-con on which one's good for what. But it is also looking to look at the correlations between your variables. And you can use this to construct a model, but again, the interpretation is messy. Messy, messy, messy. So what you have is variables that you actually observed, and what you're looking for is some truth that you didn't manage to observe. So we assume that maybe variable 3 and variable 4 might have something to do with comfort, and you tried to ask 2 questions to get at that. So factor 2 might be a comfort metric. That's why we get to the, it could have an interpretability, but usually you end up with like variable 2 tied in there and it's a mess and you're like, I don't know what this is actually supposed to be interpreted to. So we make some assumptions. We assume that the factors themselves, the truth data up there, is uncorrelated. We make some assumptions about errors, and again, the statistics, right? You have weights that are involved, all kinds of math hiding in the background. And we're going to use this to reduce, right? So I'm removing correlation, and I'm also reducing the number of questions. So let's say you ask 30 questions. That's way too much. But we were interested in things like a comfort metric, and perhaps we were interested in a usability metric, something like that. I might be looking for 2 factors. So I can take this and figure out how many different factors I actually need. And there's either goodness of fit tests, or you can use some other additional metrics in terms of interpretability and explain variance to try to figure out how many factors am I looking at. Okay. And then you can use this to actually build those real models. So I can take factors or components, now that they're uncorrelated, and use them on things like regression. And there's a whole bunch, again, a lot of information on the slides that I'm not going into. But regression assumes that you feed it independent factors, which means that it's not ideal for surveys when you start out, because by factors are usually not independent. Each survey question is going to be correlated with something else. So when would I use one or over another? If you're just worried about dimensionality, PCA is kind of useful. It accounts for your variance. If instead you might be interested in doing some interpretation, PCA is probably not good for you, because the interpretation is not going to be pretty, and it is going to account for the covariance among your variables. All right, so we'll get into a better thing for your actual categorical data, which is clustering. So you can also work to something with a large data set by grouping observations together. Now, I would argue that if you're going to do this, this is going to show you something with means, because again, I'm looking at bigger data sets. So we did a clustering algorithm using machine learning algorithms and not the female body armor analysis, which was full of Likert scales. But what it's doing is trying to group things together, right? Cluster things together. So types of clustering, you can look at dissimilarity. Either similarity or dissimilarity, how things would group together or how things would stay apart. And there's 2 main methods that I'm going to show here briefly, and one is hierarchical clustering and another is k-means clustering. And they do the same type of, I guess, methodology, except one is backwards from the other. What?
They do the same type of classification.
Yes, but one is backwards from another in that the one will group and you're kind of stuck, and one will group and then regroup depending on how many clusters and things you're looking at. So hierarchical clustering is best displayed visually because it's going to look at individual points and then try to say, these are similar, now these are similar, and make individual groups. So like I said, once assigned points do not leave a cluster, it's stuck there forever. And we want to see if we can make a smaller set of individuals from our large set of data. So when I'm talking large sets of data, consider a student evaluation where you've got 28 questions on over 5,000 students. Okay, so this is a big data set. So I want to see what relationships there are to the student responses in the questions, and I have a graph. This is called a dendrogram. And what is happening is I start with 1 million different responses at the bottom, right? So I've got that 5,000 some odd students, and it starts clustering them. And eventually it gets up to the point where I have one giant group. But you can see where the breakdown occurs, and I have multiple levels of groups. So the tricky part about this is, well, where do I cut this off? How many groups do I have? Because it just finally groups them all up together at the top. So you have to decide, this is the similarity, right? So distance matters on this graph. So maybe a distance of this wide is actually, relatively important. And so I would say that this is maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 different clusters that I'm dealing with. And your subject matter experts are going to have to decide when to stop your clustering algorithm. You can also do something with heat maps. So this is multiple clusters looked at across the spectrum. So I created 2 dendrograms, and then I used a heat map to determine where the clusters might actually lie. So it will color code it for you, basically. So I've got that gray area up at the top, strips of blue, strips of red. And this is showing you where the clusters might lie in 2 different scales, right? So you could do clustering on multiple levels. So much to do with surveys. Challenges though, like I said, cutoffs are tricky. You have to basically know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for with your clusters, there's no really way to find it. So you need your subject matter experts to talk about what you're trying to do when you're making your clusters. And they may not have interpretations. So it might be super easy to look and say, oh, maybe with my students, these are my sophomores, these are my juniors, these are my seniors. They have differing opinions based on their grades. Or it may be that there's nothing in common with those people that I can see easily. Right? That's the tricky part with surveys. K-means clustering is literally using the means to group things together. So it creates an algorithm. We're not going to get into the math again, but it's assigning points based on a mean and then grouping them together. And it repeats the process until it gets some type of convergence. So this is, again, done easily using pictures. So if I start saying with my data set, same data set as before, that I am looking for 2 clusters. So it using principal components in this case, I'm trying to find 2 clusters. It's going to assign something to either the red cluster or the blue cluster based on the overall means. If I tell it I want 3, it's going to create 3 means and create 3 groupings and then assign them. And I can keep going, right? So here's 4, here's 5. You have to decide when it has meaning for you, right? And here's 6. And by the time we hit 6, I'm going to point out that there's something weird going up here where it thinks that these 2 outlier points are probably in their own cluster up there in the world, which is not accurate, which means I would probably end up back at the 5 cluster just so I keep those grouped with group 4 there. All right, hypothesis testing. I'm going to assume most of the room is familiar with this, but surveys require a lot of their own hypothesis testing, especially for the Likert scales. More often than not, I'm using non-parametric alternatives. So t-tests are super popular, but again, Likert scale data probably shouldn't be using a t-test. I don't have the numerical data is fake, right? So if we keep that in mind, that means that normality assumption is fake, and I probably shouldn't be using any of that. I have used the Mann-Whitney U-test as an alternative for hypothesis testing for surveys.
Is that more for just like found data rather than like designed survey?
Yes, if you've designed it, you probably have a better plan ahead of you. But a lot of what I end up doing is found data because they didn't ask. Before and after, and I'm going to check on the time here. We are at time. So before and after. You can also use hypothesis testing if you take surveys before and after something and then compare them, right? And here was the paper I was talking about. They did the surveys without me, and then I had to figure out how I was going to look at it, but they had at least done pre and post surveys. So I could do a subtraction and these were scores that I had measured them on, and create something so that I could see the effect of what was going on. And finally, for the analysis, regression. So you've already seen this for PCA. Keep in mind that anytime you're using regression analysis, it's a great way to see what impact things are having in the responses, right, your individual factors, but you're assuming that your variables are independent when you're doing that. And so if you've got the dependency, you might have to get rid of something using PCA, factor analysis, something else. All right. So I'm going to leave it there unless anybody wants to stick around because it is your lunchtime and I'm going to be respectful of the time here today. But thank you so much for coming.